Chapter 9. After a night that had passed in excited talking with her mother, and later in restless sleep, Giselle awoke early. Such a night, she whispered, and such excitement. But I must hurry. I told Mamma I would make the coffee. In the kitchen, Giselle found her mother sitting at the table as if she had never been to bed. Her hair was combed straight back in its usual way, and her face was fresh from a cold water wash. She smiled at Giselle and said, "So you come to make the coffee. It is made, ma chérie, and the bread is cut, ready for eating." She gestured at the bread left over from yesterday, now piled in slices on a board. Giselle said, "Oh, maman, I am indeed sorry," and hurried to the sink to wash under the tap. Later, talking with her mother while they both dipped the stale bread in their coffee, Giselle asked, "Why don't you come too, maman? It is you who by right should give Uncle Pierre the money." Giselle's mother said, "No, he cherishes you. You and he can share it better with Marie-Therese. There must be nothing to mar his happiness." The two drank and ate, talking quickly between gulps, until all the small slices of bread were gone. Then Giselle stood up to leave. Impatience pulled at her, though she forced herself to move calmly, helping her mother to tidy the table. The last crumbs were scattered outside the door when she said, "I must go now, maman. Will you give me the money?" There was happiness then, held in a bundle of worn French Pacific notes, as Giselle's mother brought them from the bedroom, rewrapping them and rewrapping them with fumbling hands that wanted to fondle the notes lovingly. Giselle and her mother laughed and picked up fallen ones from the floor. "It is such happiness," Giselle's mother said, "that makes the good God smile. Give my love to your uncle, Uncle Pierre." Giselle tucked in the last untidy note and folded the last corner of the brown paper carefully. With the bundle held securely under one arm, she said, "Oui, maman, this will indeed be a day of blessing for Uncle Pierre and all our family." After kissing her mother, Giselle paused on the doorstep to stare searchingly toward the mountains. She wished for a fleeting, childish moment her father could see her, that he could wave from his far-off mine perched dizzyingly on a crag, to show her all was well. Instead, she saw only that a great canopy of clouds hung brooding over the mountains. They were black, heavy wreaths of darkness, majestic and still in silent waiting. From the path that led to her uncle's farm, Giselle waved for a final time to her mother, who was standing at the kitchen window, and continued on. The dusty ruts felt cool under her bare feet, and she was glad to be shaded from the ever-mounting sun. Soon, she thought, it will be up over the tree-tops, but perhaps by then the clouds will have spread until the sky is covered. It would be good to have the freshness of the rain. But the clouds hung brooding on the mountain peaks. As Giselle neared her uncle's farm, the sun flared, angling across the tree-tops. The dappled patches of sunlight burned momentarily as Giselle passed through them. It would be a day of great heat, of that she was certain. It held the menace of a sudden driving storm. Her uncle was sprawled as usual on his big brass-knobbed bedstead. His spidery body covered part of the quilt. The rest was tucked up under around him. He held out his thin, twisted hands when he saw Giselle, and she quickly placed her package on a chair. "Now, my uncle," she whispered, holding his hands pressed to her, "do not excite yourself too soon. There is something I have to tell you, something I have to give you." The words gushed from her, though she tried to hold them back. "I should not have said them," she thought, resting his hands down again on the bed. "He is so frail that one can barely speak, yet I have to tell him." Pierre said, "To see you is not to excite me, Giselle, but to warm my heart." As to what you have to tell or give, he tried to shrug, but his strength was inadequate. "Do so in your own good time. I am content to have you with me, however short the moments." His melancholy eyes lightened as he spoke, then a bitter spasm of pain made them cloud over. Giselle reached instinctively to smooth the pillows around his head. "Merci, mon oncle," she whispered. "You have indeed always been kind," and taking the package from the chair, she placed it gently between the crooked fingers of one of his frail hands. "There, my uncle," she went on, whispering soothingly, "is your journey to Lourdes, to the sacred grotto in France. There is the 8,000 francs that will see you safely there and back." For long, hushed moments Pierre Marcel lay staring at the ceiling. Then his glance wandered, searching each nook and shadow, as if seeing the room for the first time, and as if he were seeing beyond, to where there were no shadows, to where the cross on the wall was a dazzling light shining on his face. But when at last he turned to Giselle, his haggard face was drained of all color. He sagged until the bed seemed to be pulling him down into a dark and utter tiredness. "Non," he whispered. "Non, non, Giselle. Do not ever mock at me so. Why do you say such things to hurt your uncle?" And big, easing tears ran slowly down his cheeks. Giselle whispered, "Non, I do not mock or hurt, as you well know, my uncle, but it is there, as you have prayed for so long." She lightly touched the package clutched limply in his hand. "All your pain and sorrow to be washed away at Lourdes. It has been a dream for so long that one cannot believe. Even Mamma laughed this morning when the money fell on the floor." Then, between dabs at her own and her uncle's tears, Giselle told how her father and Jacques Leroux had saved the money, how they had brought it to the cottage the night before, and how they had hoped to save 10,000 francs, but had had an accident. A bullock of Monsieur Brent had been shot by Jacques, in a veritable miracle of shooting. Now it was thought that Monsieur le Gendarme would redouble his efforts to trap Monsieur Jacques and her father. Talk of such hunting and excitement seemed to revive Pierre. His mind groped at the possibility that some day now he might be well, that the blessed spring of Lourdes would bring him back to health and the sure, keen step of a hunter. "We," he whispered, "your father and his friend Jacques Leroux have done this for me." Already his voice seemed to be growing stronger, though his frail, twisted body lay unchanged, and for them some day he raised his hands, until they shook with the effort. "I shall work these hands until I repay all of you, the loved ones of my family." He lowered his arms, and a smile of sureness smoothed the lines from his face. Then he added, "I must sleep, but come again, my little one. There will be much to tell you when I have rested and spoken with Marie Therese." His eyes closed, and within moments he was asleep. The package of notes rested between his hands. Giselle smiled and watched her uncle's face, wishing she could stay. As he had said, there was indeed much to talk about, yet she knew he must rest, for even a short talk or a slight movement overtaxed his strength. Tiptoeing softly, she crept from the room. There was a peace in it now, greater than she ever remembered, as if a prayer had at last been truly answered. Outside she paused on the steps to accustom her eyes again to the sun glare. On the mountain peaks and beyond, the clouds seemed much as they had been earlier. Giselle glanced around, hoping to see Marie-Therese. At first the nearby sheds, with their racks of golden maize, seemed to be deserted. She could hear the indigenes calling gutturally to each other in a maize field some distance away. Then she saw the swirl of a rusty black skirt as a woman moved behind the structure that held the coffee bean drying trays. As Giselle drew near, she saw that Marie-Therese was selecting and scooping fully dried beans into an old sack. It hung limply, as yet no more than a quarter full. So Giselle thought, pausing on the warm red dust. One can guess what she is thinking. A kilo here, a kilo there, with perhaps Madame Duval buying several kilos, yet all of it together not bringing more than several hundred francs. Oh, there is so much happiness in what I have to tell her that. Her mind locked, blank at what she was trying to force it to picture, and she moved forward, mechanically noticing the trays were coming nearer. Then Marie-Therese straightened to say, "Bonjour, Mademoiselle Giselle. I saw you go in to see your uncle. Did you find him awake?" From the habit that stemmed from years of aloofness, she pulled the black shawl up around her head until it almost hid her face. But her eyes seemed to Giselle to be luminous with a love that could never be hidden. Suddenly finding that she could speak, Giselle said, "Oh, Madame Marie-Therese, I have something to tell you, something that today, tomorrow, next week, and for a long time, will make you forget your worries." She swung up her hands, flinging them wide as if she were throwing imaginary cares as far as she could. "You see, Madame Therese, they are going flying beyond the trees, for I have just given Uncle Pierre 8,070 francs. 8,070 francs from mon père and Monsieur Jacques Leroux. They send them with their hopes and truly given blessing." She drew her hands down and cupped them, as she had seen Father Hans do. The gesture was instinctive, and she bowed unknowingly. Marie-Therese turned away for a moment, unable to speak. When she turned again to look at Giselle, it was as if the lines had been smoothed from her face. The shawl slid from her head as she whispered, "Is it true? Have they indeed given him the money?" Giselle said, "It is truly so, Madame Therese," and she repeated all she had told her uncle, while Marie-Therese stood gazing toward the weatherboard house where Pierre Marcel was sleeping. At last, when Giselle had finished speaking, there was a long silence until Marie-Therese said, "So it has come. The dreams and hopes are now realities, and you have made them so." Yes, her voice lowered so that it seemed to be coming from far away. "I have always known that you would. Each crab, each fish, saved a few francs, which have now grown to a flood. Oh, ma chérie, how can I ever thank you?" She gripped Giselle's shoulders and kissed her on both cheeks. The scent of sandalwood surged, sweeter than the smell of drying coffee beans. Awed by the closeness of the woman and the gentleness of her lips, Giselle suddenly felt she had to run, had to leave. Never had she thought to be held by Marie Therese or kissed by her. Now the memory was warm, and she wanted to hold it unspoiled, without further talk of the money. This woman loved her uncle, and in loving him gave him the courage to hold to his faith, now that some love had to bear the burden of the many things that would have to be done. Softly Giselle said, "Merci, Madame Therese. It was kind of you to kiss me. Now I must go. You will have much to do and much to say to my uncle. Tomorrow I will come, and perhaps there will be some things in which I can help." Marie Therese pulled the shawl up around her head and walked beside Giselle. They were close to the house before Marie Therese said, "We, until tomorrow then. Come early if the weather permits. Those storm clouds look as if they could bring a change. Not in our happiness, you understand, but in this continuous dryness." She spoke haltingly, eager to say more, yet aware of the urgency pulling Giselle. The girl had hurried to bring the money and see her uncle. Now the emotional peak was past, and she wanted for the moment to find normalcy, the familiar paths that led to familiar places. Her feet were already moving into a half-running walk. Each whispered, "Au revoir," as if for fear of waking Pierre Marcel, and Giselle and Marie Therese parted near the veranda steps. Before going inside the house, Marie Therese added, "Go happily with all our love, mine and your uncle's. The vision is true now, and will come ever nearer." Giselle said, "Oui, amen, Madame Therese," and began to run. There was such a sense of release from all that had led up to the morning's climax that she had no sense of time or motion, just an eager, unleashed feeling that bore her along on air. She neither saw the gate-post when she passed between them, leaving her uncle's farm, nor noticed her general direction. Then gradually she began to steady. "I am silly," she thought. "One would think I am running from hurt, not happiness." Dear uncle's face shone as if it were lit from within, and Madame Therese, oh, such thankful eyes I have never seen. The thought made her feel again, for the moment, the imprint of lips, warm on her cheeks, and smell the scent of sandalwood clinging to dark, somber clothes. Suddenly she flicked back her hair, clearing it from her eyes. It was good to know now that there were no more worries, no more troubles, no more wondering where the francs would come from to help Uncle Pierre. The whole sum was there now, gathered into his shadowy old house. She ran on contentedly. Near a clump of tangled bougainvilleas, Giselle dug her toes in the dust and came to a stop. Edouard was standing holding 2 fishing spears in one hand and a satchel of fishing gear in the other. His tousled head bent when he smiled and said, "Bonjour, Mademoiselle Giselle. I saw you ahead of me when you entered your uncle's farm, and thought I would wait. Do you mind if I walk just a little way with you?" His voice was pitched slightly high so that it would not break. Giselle said, "Non, of course not, my friend. We have walked many kilometers together since we were very, very small. Why should we not walk now?" With a quick shake of her head, she swirled the long hair away from her face so that she could look closely at Edouard. He used the 2 spears as a staff when he began to walk by her side, And for a while there was silence. Then Giselle added, "But you have not said what you really want to say, have you, Edouard? There is a great joy, is there not, in your every movement?" As she spoke, she wished she could tell Edouard of her own happiness, tell him that Uncle Pierre now had all the money he needed to fly on his pilgrimage. But she remembered her father asking that, for the time being, no one should be told, a message she had passed on to Uncle Pierre and Marie-Therese. Edouard said, "We, my dear friend Giselle, the news has come, and my parents have agreed. I go to Noumea next week to begin my training, and from there to France and Italy. At last I shall follow the call of God." He raised the spears, and his eyes glowed with an inner burning passion. The skinny bare-toed boy seemed to tower brightly. Then, as suddenly, the flame died. The spears drooped, and Edward used them to trudge along with again. Neither he nor Giselle spoke until Jeanine Michel appeared, coming toward them from the village. She carried a loaf of bread in one hand and a bottle of lemonade in the other. Even from that distance she emanated eagerness to be with her brother. Edouard said, "We are going to fish on the reef for the last time. Monsieur Vache has lent us his boat. You understand, Giselle. For this last week I must be with my family. They love me as I love them. It is my duty." He ended flatly, wanting to say more, yet not knowing quite what. Giselle said, "I understand, Edouard. When it is time, perhaps I shall see you at the bus. Or perhaps you will call one night with your family to say good-bye to my mother." Edouard swallowed and wiped his face on his arm. The heat was oppressive on the now unshaded path they were following. "Oui," he said, "I shall call, never fear. And for you," he halted momentarily to look at Giselle. "It is my dearest wish you should come to the bus. Who is to know what the years may bring? And who is to know where God will send me? You understand, Giselle, that once I leave, my thoughts must be only of him." He whispered the last sentence, as if it were being forced from his mouth. Giselle said, "I understand, Edouard. You do not have to keep asking me whether I do. Now I will wave to Jeanine Michel, and leave you two alone. May you have a glorious day fishing together." She waved, and Jeanine Michel answered with an upward jerk of the lemonade bottle, before Giselle added, "Au revoir, Edouard. Thank you for waiting to tell me." Without glancing back, she ran from the path into a clump of silver-barked nioli trees, and as she threaded her way between the spindly trunks, she could sense that Edouard was staring after her. His eyes, she guessed, were as full as her own of unshed tears. They were so blinding that she ran by instinct, dodging the spiky branches. Chapter 10. By noon, the clouds hovering on the mountain peaks had spread to a sky-covering grayness. Sitting opposite her mother, after eating cold tinned meat and bread that was still warm from the bakery, Giselle wondered about Edouard and his sister, Jeanine Michel. Since leaving them, Giselle had spent an hour or more alone, then had gone to the bakery. As always, Monsieur and Madame Darnel had overwhelmed her with their kindness. After large, floury embraces and hot buttered bread, added to this morning by a special cheese from Noumea, Giselle had hurried home to find her mother anxiously awaiting. In quick, eager words, between mouthfuls of unwanted food, Giselle had told and retold all that had happened at Pierre Marcel's. When Giselle described her Uncle Pierre's disbelieving face and the subsequent agony of his joy, her mother had cried. To be given such happiness is indeed a blessing, she had said. It was well I sent you alone, my daughter. Never could I have done such a difficult task. I would be there yet, still crying over my brother's pain. Now, with the remains of the meal in front of her, Giselle thought of Edouard and his sister. On a full tide, under the dull, overcast sky, they should catch many fish. Fish always swarmed nearer to the surface when shaded from the sun's fierce brightness. Sensing her daughter's restlessness, Madame Gironde said, "Drink up your coffee and leave Giselle. There is little here that you can do." She gestured limply, aware now, after the excitement of talking, that it was truly hot. "I shall rest, and afterward, who knows, perhaps I shall quietly go to see your Uncle Pierre. He will be rested, and Madame Therese will have had time to soothe him." There was a note of thankfulness in her final sentence, and she lifted the high collar of her blouse for a moment to let in cooling air. Giselle said, "Merci, maman. It will be cooler by the sea. Are you sure there is nothing here I can do for you?" The coffee burned her mouth when she drank, but she ignored the pain. She was seeing already the swirling waves curl in on the beach, smelling the fresh salt tang and the muddy breath of mangroves. Yet, as she bent to kiss her mother's damp cheeks, Giselle sighed. She wished that the excitement of the night before and of the morning could have lasted. Outside she felt suddenly free. The world was huge after the imprisoning rooms of the little cottage. Her mother, father, Uncle Pierre, Monsieur and Madame Darnel, and all the villagers were a cage in which she had to fit. Then Giselle steadied her pace to a walk. Passing through the village, she was glad it was the hour of siesta. Each building was hushed to the somnolence of rest, and after eating, except on the veranda of Madame Duval's cafe, where several men were just leaving. One was Edouard's father, Monsieur Ruenda, and he stopped Giselle to say, "Ah, bonjour, Mademoiselle Giselle. I do not often see you. You have heard the good news, I suppose, that Edouard is leaving, that if the good God is kind, he will one day wear his blessed cloth." Monsieur Ruenda's hand flicked. Crossing over his breast, he drew himself upright, tall with the pride that was flooding through him. His eyes glowed with a greater fire than that of Madame Duval's wine. Giselle said, "Oui, monsieur, it is indeed good news, though one could feel a sorrow. Will there not be much that Edouard will miss? These people, this place," she gestured around at the quiet, hushed buildings, the men who had left the cafe with the man in front of her, and the fishing. Will he not miss that more than anything? Her hands clenched as she remembered Edouard's and her own sadness earlier in the morning. Monsieur Ruenda nodded. He loved his son and could already feel the cords being severed from his heart. "Aye," he said, "that is true, my little one, yet it is not I alone who has come to this decision. Edouard, Father Hans, Madame Ruenda, and myself must all share equally, though it is Edouard alone who lit the first spark." He nodded, convincing himself that his words were true. A small tear welled in the corner of each eye. It is the wine, Giselle thought, that smudges his brain of the truth. Now the tears slide because of the utter finality. Aloud she said, "Oui, monsieur, perhaps it is as you say. He is a boy of great gentleness." Edouard's father said, "Aye, and of thought for others. He talks of you often, and of the illness of your Uncle Pierre." One of the men waved. shouting that Madame Ruenda would be angry if kept waiting for her meal, and Edouard's father waved in reply. "I must go," he told Giselle, "for Madame waits and the other little ones cluster at the table. We shall miss Edouard for his ability to fish." In answer to another shout and wave, he hurried off then, still shaking his head. Giselle stood watching the men disappear. Each in his turn seemed to fold away into a house or along a path that led to a home, until only Edouard's father was left. Then he too was gone, merged into the riotous tangle of bougainvillea that grew each side of the track. So Giselle whispered, "The road lies empty, and it will indeed be more empty after Edouard has gone." She turned to walk across the road into the bush. On the path again, she glanced up anxiously at the sky. Its leaden grayness hung above the motionless sweep of scrub and trees in a stifling smother. She could feel the humid heat being forced down upon her, that it would storm, she was certain, though when, no one could say. She had known similar skies to last for days before bursting into deluge. She shivered, remembering other storms. The rain was truly cold after the heat had burned one's skin, yet it brought a freshness that washed away dirt and the ever-drifting dust from the roads. Reaching Monsieur Brent's unfenced property, Giselle knelt in the shallow stream and splashed her face with water. Then cupping 2 handfuls, she held them above her head to let a cool, refreshing trickle run down her back. "Oh," she gasped, repeating the process. One could kneel here forever, soaked in such coolness. She was combing her fingers through her now wet hair when she heard a car, or was it a jeep? She stood up to listen more carefully and make certain, but the whining drone of the engine eluded her. She was standing, squeezing water from the hem of her dress, when a scrub-scarred utility truck lurched into view. It was Monsieur l'Australien's, and he was sitting hunched over the wheel, every lurching sway bouncing him up and down on the seat. When the truck splashed into the stream, it began a slippery, slithery motion, crossing on the rounded, submerged stones. As the truck passed, sending an eddying swirl of water around Giselle's legs, the Australian called, "Bonjour, mademoiselle. We seem to meet in the strangest places." He drove the utility up the slightly sloping bank, then braked it to a stop. He stretched stiffly when he opened the door and stepped out onto the grassy ground. Giselle said, "Oui, and bonjour, monsieur. One would never think to see you here. This is the property of Monsieur Brent." She waved her hand, gesticulating at the surrounding bush. The Australian nodded. Sweat was running down his dusty face, and he sloshed into the stream to wash. After a few gasping splutters, he said, "Yes, I know, but this path leads to a gate in our boundary fence. He does not mind if I or some of my stockmen use it." But he did not add his real reason for being there, that he was reconnoitering the ground for that night, when he and Monsieur le Gendarme planned to hide and wait. Recently, many deer had been seen in the nearby cattle company boundary paddock, If the day's cloudiness prevailed without breaking into a storm or downpour, conditions would be good for night hunters. In the jet darkness, their torches would throw a brilliant beam, blinding the deer with their brightness. Unaware of the manager's thoughts or reasons, Giselle agreed that a boundary gate was close by. She knew it well, she said, but had not been near it for a long while. The last time I saw it, she added, there was much scrub and lantana bush grown up around the gate. One could have barely opened it. The Australian smiled. He wished he could be as truthful with Giselle as she was with him. Her direct manner contrasted ill with what he had to hide from her. As sure as anything, he thought, if the weather holds as it is, and we trap a hunter or hunters, her father will be one of the men with a rifle. She'll never want to see me, never mind, talk to me afterward. Aloud he said, the heat is enormous today. One can feel it pressing down like a blanket. He half waved his hand toward the cloud-covered sky. Giselle said, that is why I was sitting in the river. The Australian said, but tell me, would not the sea be better? Another few 100 meters, and you would be there, running on the sand. Giselle said, I am on my way now, monsieur. It is just that I paused to rest for a moment. She was quiet then, still standing ankle-deep in water, and the Australian clambered back into his utility truck. He started the motor and rested a hand on the gear lever before he said, so once again, it is au revoir, mademoiselle. Mention me to your mother and Uncle Pierre. Tell him I shall call, perhaps within a few days. He nodded, bobbing his head in a semi-formal way, as if he were bowing. Giselle called, oui, monsieur, and merci, wishing for some quick way to show Monsieur l'Australian that she and others in the village thought well of him. She suddenly added, if monsieur desires, there may be good fish in the boucherie tonight. Edouard has gone out in Monsieur Vache's boat. The Australian switched off the engine again and stepped from the utility. Gone out, he said, jerking a thumb at the sky. In this, how far has he gone, and where? His habitual air of authority returned, and he stared at Giselle intently. She said, I do not know for sure, monsieur. To the reef somewhere beyond the Ile des Pins. That is certain. The fish are plentiful there, and Edouard knows their feeding grounds well. She stared anxiously back at the Australian, knowing he was sharing her own worry. The Australian said, more to himself than to Giselle, it is always the same with those who are familiar. They ignore danger that others. He paused, undecided what to say or do. There was always this problem of becoming involved with the local people, and the danger of intruding upon their characteristic independence. If a boy chose to borrow a boat and go fishing when the sky was heavily overcast, that was his affair, or that of his parents, or others in the village, not that of an outsider. Watching intently, Giselle saw the Australian's shoulders slump. So, she thought, he cannot find a way. His mind has told him not to interfere, yet one can see his heart says otherwise. Stepping quickly from the stream, she said, do not fear, monsieur. All will be well with Edouard and his sister. They wished to make this last day of fishing together a day of all days to remember, the Australian said. So the boy goes at last to be a priest, but your saying that he has his sister with him makes it doubly worrying, mademoiselle. I shall watch for them from my house. Adieu, I must surely go this time. Once again he clambered into the utility truck, and it lurched away, bumping on the uneven track and brushing against the overgrown scrub. Pleased, Giselle kissed both hands, then waved them after the fast disappearing utility truck. So, she said, now all is well. Edouard and Jeanine Michel will not come to harm. Monsieur l'Australian has said he will watch for them. But when she reached the beach, Giselle's foreboding returned. The sea stretched in a great oily sheet under the threatening sky, and even the tide flow, creeping eerily into the mangrove channels, made no ripple. The water seemed black, reflecting the dull, unmoving clouds. The completely darkened the sun. "Oh la la," Giselle whispered. "It is a tide for sharks. Why, oh why did Edouard choose such a day?" Then she remembered it was not of his choosing. It is others, she thought, who plan his movements. They say this day for that, and that day for this, so that he may ultimately catch a bus, the final bus that will take him from our lives and this village. She began to run, eager to draw level with the Ile-des-Pins, one of a group of tiny islets lying off the cattle company's foreshores. And as she ran, splashing along on the tide's edge, she prayed that Edouard had started to row home, that he and his sister had filled their boat with fish, and there was no longer any need to stay. "Let this be a day of days," she whispered, as Edouard wanted. "Let the fish be piled in mounds around their feet." Yet after she had run the long distance to bring her abreast of the island, she could see no sign of Monsieur Vache's boat. In the murky haze of sea and sky, she could see the island, with its crowning knob-like hillock of sprouting pine trees, but its outline was hazed, merged almost into its background of dusky sea and sky. The thin white line of the reef foaming behind the island, and others of its group, showed clearly between the gaps, as if it were a line, smudged by several blobs of uncertain shape, drawn right across the picture. Gasping, Giselle flopped down onto the warm, steamy sand. Her heart thudded from the exertion and the stifling humid heat. She wished she could plunge into the sea, then wade or swim the 300 or 400 meters between the beach and the island. The thought made her shiver. The water was deep, to an unknown depth in places. Sharks, stingrays, and the huge vache la mer lurked and bred in its weed-grown bed. She wished, too, that she had asked Edouard if she could go with him. She stood up and began to walk again, staring anxiously out to sea. "If I was in the boat, I could say, Edouard, and you, too, Jeanine Michel, it is time to go home. We have more than enough fish for everyone. Let us row before a great storm breaks." Absorbed, Giselle scuffed the smooth, slow-swirling water with her feet. She wished there was another boat she could row out to the islands in, but Monsieur Vache's was the only boat owned in the village. Monsieur l'Australian had one she knew, So did Monsieur White, the American. Farther along the coast, Monsieur Yoko, the fisherman, lived on an isolated headland in the opposite direction. His craft was a heavy, cumbersome ship's dinghy washed overboard from some freighter that had foundered on the reef during the war. Too big, Giselle thought, even if I could run that far. Besides, Monsieur Yoko is probably away at Lafayette, where he sells his fish. Feeling more and more anxious, Giselle continued to stare out to sea. Each island kept presenting a different facet as she half ran, half walked northward along the cattle company's foreshores. Somewhere in the dull, awesome haziness must be the boat bearing Edouard and his sister. But stare as she would, Giselle could see neither the boat nor its occupants. Some far part of the Ile-de-Pins must be sheltering them from her view. Perhaps Edouard and his sister had gone ashore to picnic. Then suddenly, uncontrollably, Giselle began to run. "It is no use," she whispered, panting the words out between her teeth. "I must find Monsieur l'Australian. Something dreadful has happened, or is going to happen, of that I am certain." When at last she reached the little wharf that nestled beneath the Australian's house, all the breath was pumped from Giselle's body. She felt that her lungs were swelling into her mouth to choke her. Sweat ran in rivulets down the overheated skin of her neck and face. Thankfully, she saw that the Australian was already at the wharf, pouring gasoline into the engine of his boat. He refilled the can and lashed it to a strut as Giselle, gasping, splashed across the last few shallow meters of water. Without speaking or showing any surprise, because he had seen her coming from a long way off, the Australian snatched a bucket from his boat and dashed bucketful after bucketful of water over Giselle until her breathing was normal. "So," he said, "it is rough, mademoiselle, but serves its purpose. Now tell me quickly, have you seen any sight of the boat? I have rung Monsieur White, whose boat is bigger and more powerful than mine, and he is meeting me out at the headland." He jerked a thumb seaward, freeing one hand for a moment from the moorings he was untying. He did not add that he had also telephoned Monsieur le Gendarme to cancel the evening's appointment, and that Monsieur le Gendarme was even now racing his jeep against time to be at the two boats' rendezvous. Giselle pushed the streaming hair away from her face and said, "No, monsieur, no sign, but the wind is coming, bringing rain. At first I could sense it, but now it is sure. One can see it there, against the skyline." The Australian said, "Yes, and the glass is falling. Now run back to the village, warn Edouard's parents that there may be an accident." As he stepped over the gunwales into the boat, Giselle stepped with him. Crouching down, she wrapped both her arms around a seat. "Non," she shouted. "Non, monsieur. I must come too. I know the islands better than you or Monsieur White." She gripped the seat until her hands ached. Monsieur was angry, but she did not care. Edouard and Jeanine Michel were her friends. She would fight, scratch, or claw if need be to stay in the boat and guide it to where they might be. The Australian saw her determination. Time was the great essential, he knew, if the reef was to be reached before the oncoming wind. Even as he turned to start the motor, he felt a freshening breath of air brush across his face. To argue, he said over his shoulder, or waste time would be foolish. Sit on the seat and stay centered. 1 centimeter either way, and you could capsize us." The motor roared, and with a wild, lunging lift, the boat plunged forward at full speed. Its bows rose, careening on the flat water. The Australian crouched, straddling his legs, as his whole body braced, bent over the tiller. Almost torn from her grip, Giselle stayed, crouched on her knees. It is better so, she thought, for Monsieur to see. Peering sideways, she kept her gaze fixed on the distant group of tiny islands. Beyond them, wild on the hazy skyline, swirled a great wall of wind-whipped waves. Now she was sure there had been an accident. Edouard and Jeanine Michel would have seen the storm long before this. Each would have clutched an oar and, straining every nerve sinew, striven to drive the boat shoreward. Gradually, as she gathered the flying hair from about her face, she ranged her gaze slowly along the shoreline. As the boat cleared the last obscuring headland she had run across, she saw the far-off straggling pin dots of people hurrying along the beach. They were, she judged, just coming abreast of the Ile-de-Pins, at a point where she had paused recently. They were villagers, she knew, roused at last to the non-arrival of Edouard and his sister by sight of the oncoming storm. She guessed each one in the wavering line of people was bowed by worry. It was always so when the sea snarled, ready to snatch more victims. Then, as Giselle searched, staring out to sea once more, she thought her eyes were deceiving her. Something white flickered briefly against the sea and sky's hazy grayness. The tiny white flicker was so minute, and disappeared so quickly, that she thought it must be a curl of foam on a rock. Yet before she could pause to think or recheck, she heard herself shouting, "Look, Monsieur, something white shows beyond the Ile-de-Pins." It could be the shirt of Edouard or the chimsy of Jeanine Michel. She turned quickly, making the boat roll dangerously. "Steady," the Australian said, "or you will have us over. Are you sure, or could it have been a wave break?" He swayed, bracing to the boat's new movements. The sea was beginning to heave in advance of the nearing storm. Its forefront seemed to be boiling just beyond the foaming washed reef. But he knew that that wasn't so. As with all tropical sea storms, the one approaching was deceptive. It had the appearance of hovering, yet was in reality traveling at express speed. That it seemed to be still while actually traveling at a great pace was an optical illusion that had baffled many a sailor. Peering again, Giselle saw that the boat's speed and the angle of its course had changed her view. One of the tiny islands was murkily between the boat's bow and where she had seen the white speck. As she strained her eyes, still hoping to see, the Australian steered the boat into the sand-fringed inlet he had been heading for. Without pause, he grounded the boat high on the sand, stopped the motor, and leaped overboard, with a rope to make fast. "Hurry," he shouted. "Monsieur White is coming, and Monsieur le Gendarme is already here. Every minute counts." He gripped Giselle's hand as she balanced on the gunwales, then ran with her along the sand. They joined Monsieur le Gendarme farther down the beach, just as a powerful launch swirled in a wild loop to come to a stop broadside to the waiting three. Without speaking, Monsieur le Gendarme clambered in first. His immaculate khaki trousers were dripping wet as he bent to help Giselle. The Australian scrambled in after her, and Monsieur White, the American, shouted, "Where to? Have you seen them by any chance?" He used English, shouting the words into the Australian's ear, while the boat leaped into a throttle-wide outburst. Its bow cleaved the now heaving sea until the foam crested up over them. Around the cockpit was a handrail, and Giselle clung to it with both hands. Monsieur le Gendarme stood next to her, eyes slighted against the spray, while he stared ahead, unused to boats. He balanced awkwardly, planting his feet wide on the narrow deck. Behind her, Giselle heard the Australian shouting in English. Then he came forward to say, "Ah, Monsieur le Gendarme, you made it in time. Let us hope we shall do the same for Edouard and his sister." The gendarme nodded. A great scud of spray came overboard, leaving his shirt soaked and streaming as he said, "Oui, monsieur, that is our greatest wish." Then after wiping his face, he added, "Have you seen them, monsieur? Is it possible that they may be well?" The Australian said, "Yes, I think so." Giselle thought she saw them, or what might have been a signal. He ended in a gasp, while all on board crouched, as if piled onto rocks. The launch shuddered violently when the first blast of the storm ripped over its length, a giant seething wave seeming to boil up from underneath, added to the impact. For several frightening moments Giselle thought her arms would tear out of their sockets. She heard Monsieur l'Australian shouting to her to hang on, and she felt Monsieur le Gendarme grip one of her arms. Behind her, in the smother, Monsieur White shouted, and miraculously, though still pitching to the following seas that curled under blinding sheets of rain, the launch came back on course. "Now," the Australian shouted, "now we must truly search. Ease back with me, Giselle, to stand by Monsieur White. You must guide him as best you can." Aided by her bare feet, Giselle balanced better than the Australian was able to, and reached the helmsman first. Monsieur White shouted, "Good," and smiling through the streaming rain, splattering in his face, added, "Just give me a sign whether to go left or right." Crouched in the stern, just behind the American, Giselle touched his hand occasionally to indicate direction. Near the first of the small group of islands, she pointed to where the sandbanks and rocks were. The visibility was such that it was not possible to see beyond 100 meters. As the island passed abeam, Giselle whispered, "Oh, la la, it is not possible to see them. The boat of Monsieur Vache must be surely capsized." The Australian heard her, and crouching lower said, "It is possible, mademoiselle. As I recall, this is the little island that was between us and the whiteness you saw. So now we must steer on a line that will center between the Ile-de-Pins and the reef." Giselle said, "We," and listened to the Australian shouting to the American. In front, Monsieur le Gendarme, spray-drenched, and sodden, still clung to the rail. His once shiny peaked cap sagged pulpily on his head. Only the chin strap buckled tightly under his chin saved the cap from being blown off. Both the Australian and the American were bare-headed. Their hair streamed, as did Giselle's, each time she pushed it away from her eyes. She shivered as the launch plunged clear of the lee of the tiny island. Even above the howl of the storm, the roar from the reef was terrifying. It sounded to Giselle as if thousands of miners were blasting the ocean bed for nickel. She could imagine each thunderous roar as bringing tons of smothering water cascading down on her head. Then after what seemed jolting, storm-tossed hours on the new course, though it must of a necessity have been only minutes, Monsieur le Gendarme suddenly shouted, "Voilà, c'est ça, there is a whiteness. To the left, monsieur, there now, and steady. We are heading straight on." As if catapulted, Giselle leaped across the slippery deck to stand by Monsieur le Gendarme. Through the fears and the worries that had clouded her mind, she was remembering where Edouard and his sister must be. If the whiteness was their signal, they were on a long sandy atoll almost directly between the Ile-de-Pins and the reef. At full tide it was completely covered, but at low tide offered crystal-clear pools for wading and spear-fishing. And suddenly she whirled, slipping off balance to fall against the Australian. "Oh la la, monsieur," she almost screamed. "Why did I not think? Why, monsieur, why? It is a place one would come for a happy day to remember." The Australian caught her and for a moment held her against his chest. Ahead, in the spuming spray, as the American coasted the engine, he could see only one figure. It was that of Jeanine Michel, clinging desperately to a deeply embedded fishing spear on the last high mound of sand. Around and over her scudded the pelting beat of rain and waves. Whipping from her hands, gripped tightly to the spear, fluttered the whiteness of her chemise. "God," he whispered in English, "however has she made it? And Edouard, oh God, don't let it be." But apart from that one lonely, tiny figure, the seething sea was empty. No sign showed of Edouard or Monsieur Vache's boat. Giselle turned and felt an iciness grip her sodden body. The good God was kind, and Edouard was to be a priest. How could he not be there with Jeanine Michel? And Giselle knew why. As the launch tossed wildly, nosing in toward the sandbank, only death could have parted him from his sister. Edouard would die to save her from any disaster. Feeling the tears run warm down the coldness of her face, Giselle waited while Monsieur le Gendarme and Monsieur l'Australian leaned overboard to lift Jeanine Michel aboard. She was numbed with fear, cold, and shock, but managed to whisper, "Edouard is gone. We were cut off from our boat. Edouard swam to try to reach it. Something pulled him down." She moaned, trying to pull away, and Monsieur le Gendarme picked her up in his arms. Steadied by the Australian, he carried her down to the little cabin. As she followed, Giselle heard Monsieur, white, shouting above the roar of wind, rain, and sea, and Monsieur l'Australian turned to brush past her. His hands were gentle when they held her for a moment while the launch pitched steeply. Then he was gone into the wildness on deck. They will search, Giselle thought, kneeling beside Monsieur le Gendarme, but will not find. The sea has a power beyond the reach of God. She sobbed then, pressed close to Monsieur le Gendarme, and holding the hands of Jeanine Michel. There was sorrow beyond expression in the numbness of her being. So at last the launch veered around to lurch and pitch its way shoreward. At the beach the Australian and the American stood to one side, holding the heaving launch steady. They were foreigners, and could not wholly enter the villagers' grief. Monsieur le Gendarme was helped over the gunwales, and he carried Jeanine Michel up the beach. There the great arms of Jacques Leroux took her from him to bear her to the village. Monsieur and Madame Ruenda walked behind, grieved beyond endurance. They had to be helped by others, less close in their ties of kinship to the dead boy. As she was swung ashore by Monsieur l'Australian, Giselle saw her father and mother, with Monsieur and Madame Darnel, come arms stretched toward her. She staggered forward stiffly. The warmth of arms and bodies seemed greater than she had ever remembered, and their safety was reassuring. She felt that the storm-lashed sea was being pushed away from her. All this love was a barrier no other force could break. That her father and Jacques Leroux should be there gave no surprise. Always, at scent of danger, the villagers drew together. By horseback or truck or by telephone, they gathered their own to share in sorrow or disaster. In the village, each went his separate way, to leave the Ruenda family to mourn alone. It was the custom, and stalking onward with the rain-drenched girl in his arms, Jacques Leroux led the Ruenda family homeward. At the branch in the path, where the glistening bougainvillea loomed darkly, Giselle's father and mother guided her between them. "Come, my little one," Giselle's father said. "It is here. We must leave them. Our friend Jacques Leroux is the only one necessary." His voice choked, filling his throat. He wished that there were words which could console his daughter, but he knew that there were none. Gently he said to his wife, "Take her, ma chérie, and ease her if you can. I will wait here for Jacques Leroux." But Giselle caught his arm. "Non, papa," she whispered. "You come with us too. Let us be for tonight and always a true and thankful family." She was seeing, as she whispered, the loneliness of Edouard, seeing him lost in the cruel grey sea. Her father said, that would be a great happiness." Then he walked with Giselle and her mother, holding them both by an arm stretched tightly around their shoulders. Through the drone of driving rain came a distant tolling. It was the mission school bell mourning the loss of Edouard.